So there's a topic that I wrote about a couple of years ago on the blog because it was trending a bit on the different blogospheres. And it was specifically about this question of should people stop reading books by white male authors? And I know that it ruffled a lot of feathers, particularly with people who are fans of, say, John Green or Stephen King or Neil Gaiman, people that they do feel either represent them as women or represent them as people of color, even though the authors themselves are white men. Or conversely, it's people who are rightfully saying that they don't feel that they should be preached to about what they want to read or what they do read, and so on. And this argument about how preachy we're being when we talk about diversity does seem to be something that people get concerned about. And I'm not going to sit here and tell anyone that they don't have a right to be concerned about it. Having said that, I think that a lot of the criticism surrounding this question did miss the point. And to me, ultimately, the point of this question had less to do with saying John Green is evil, or Neil Gaiman is evil, or men are evil, or white men are evil, or white people are evil, although that one, like, obviously I have something invested in thinking that one's not true. I mean, we are, but I have something invested in thinking it's not true. I think that the real point essentially got excluded. And the real point ultimately is this. If you can trust white men, and we'll just talk about white men, although I am fully aware that white women are far more represented than, say, men of color, certainly other women of color, etc. But just talking about that question of white men, if you look at that and you go, okay, someone like Neil Gaiman or John Green or whoever you want to throw out, for me it would be somebody like Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, etc., or any number of these authors, Chaucer, Shakespeare, I could keep going forever, obviously. If you can have one particular group of people come out with entirely different genres, characters, worlds, etc., time travel and space travel and all of that, if you can have that from one group of people, how many more stories are there from absolutely everyone else who doesn't occupy that one very small portion of the population? And I know that the flip side of this argument, the humanist side of this argument, would be to say that even categorizing white men as white men when they've all had completely different life experiences, perhaps, is unfair in and of itself. But I think that the point still remains. We do still need to look at why a particular group of people or race or gender or sexuality is privileged above another. And so the problem with it is that it's not just about Neil Gaiman or John Green in a vacuum. It's about the way that these authors are perceived, the way that their books are sold, the way that their books are published in the first place, the way that they're then rewarded after the fact, the way that they are adored by particular fans. All of these things do come ultimately in part from a place of privilege. And privilege doesn't mean that every single white man who wants to publish a book gets it published and nobody else does. Obviously, that's not true. But things like the Orange Prize, which is now the Costa Prize, were set up because prizes like the Man Booker were so often going to this very narrow demographic. And so on the one hand, you can say, yes, absolutely, white men can occupy such a unique place as any human can, of being able to understand a variety of people, to build worlds, to travel into space, etc., specifically through their writing. But so can a whole host of other people who are routinely being ignored. And so what this challenge is ultimately meant to be about is to say, let's have a look at this enormous other pool of people for whatever space of time you want, if it's a month, if it's 3 months, if it's a year, but that it's a way of saying, if you are one of the people who's been sort of locked into going after the prizes or going after, particular book lists, or what's, being promoted really heavily in bookstores, mainstream bookstores more so, or what's being pushed out by the publishers. If you do want to break out of that, then it's a good way of challenging yourself and asking yourself what else is out there. And I genuinely think that's ultimately all it's meant to be about. It's not, like I said, it's not about punishing white men, and it's not about saying that their books don't have value or can't have range. That is obviously not the case, but it is certainly the case that we have been told how much range and how much uniqueness they can have at the expense often of other writers. And so if you spend a year reading women of color, men of color, disabled men, LGBT women, disabled women, you know, any group that you want that's not in this very narrow category, and you come out of it and say, no, absolutely nobody that I read during that time period was as talented as, you know, a handful of white male authors. You would be entitled to that opinion. But it does seem unlikely, doesn't it? That we do praise this narrow group for having this ability to create so much. And yet there are so many other creators and writers and authors out there who aren't getting the same level of exposure, which can be unfair. And more than that, just as a reader, it is interesting to be able to go outside of your comfort zone and really look at what else is out there. I will say that there is another element to this argument. And the element that I have heard is actually from, say, authors of color. I won't go through every single category every time, but you know what I mean, non-white male authors. Who will say that what they don't like is the feeling that somebody's only reading their books because they are trying to read for diversity. That has its own string of problems because you don't then want to treat it like some kind of reading tourism where you're only reading it because you've challenged yourself to do so. That can be demeaning. And then it can continue to be you viewing these books as others as opposed to whatever you consider the norm to be. So there are a lot of things to consider. But I mean, I will say this, and it's one example, but J.K. Rowling specifically picked the initials J.K. because she didn't necessarily want people to know that she was a woman when she was writing initially. And then you go, well, now, apart from E.L. James, which, again, initials, but, you know, so on and so forth. But apart from E.L. James, she is like one of the best-selling authors of all time, certainly in the United Kingdom. And then when it comes time for her to pick a pseudonym for the Cormoran Strike books, again, she picks a male pseudonym. And so even though both she and E.L. James, regardless of what you think of 50 Shades, and I'm right there with you, but even though women are at the top of sales in the United Kingdom, both of these authors still feel that they either need to represent themselves with initials or with specifically male pseudonyms. So that does tell you kind of the position that the publishing industry is still in. And not to mention the fact that they're both white women. So you don't know to what extent they would have struggled to even publish with male names or with initials if they hadn't been white women in the first place. So again, I know that this can be a really heated issue, and I want to state one last time, it's not about demonizing anyone, it's not about saying anyone's a bad author, it's just about saying if you are interested in doing a challenge like this, I would probably encourage it. It can be interesting to step outside of your comfort zone. You do, again, want to watch not feeling like you're sort of a tourist in diversity. That can be kind of offensive. And I think that you also want to potentially be open to the idea of, you know, fuck it. If you do just really want to read American Gods, go ahead and read American Gods, even if Neil Gaiman should technically be on your ban list. At the end of the day, nobody is here to tell you what to read. Go ahead and read what you want to read. But if nothing else, and I have found this at least to be true, make a habit of going through a bookstore, going through a library, see what gets primarily featured, see what gets primarily published, see what kind of gets, you know, the best covers or the biggest coverage from book lists and prize lists and so on. If you are in a country like Canada Reads, I know did go out of its way to try to have a more diverse group of authors within that category. But then it's notable that they had that diverse category because they had a diverse group of people picking it. And that's the heart of the issue often, is that you have a very specific canon that wants to read things that reflect their worldview. And that makes sense. That is how a lot of people consume entertainment. But then when it's all the same type of person determining that canon, whether it is publishers, whether it is book journalists, whether it is even the type of people who have the money to go out and constantly buy books and recommend them to other people, you are going to get a very narrow group of authors or a very narrow experience from that potentially. So again, this has been a bit of a word salad. If you want to debate with me in the comments, I'm happy to do so. I won't field any kind of active hatred. And believe me, as somebody who has been outspoken on the internet for quite a few years, my interpretation of outspoken hatred is pretty strong. It does not mean I'm going to hate anyone who disagrees with me. So if you do disagree with me, I completely understand. And if it's something that you either feel strongly about one way or the other, something you've been thinking about challenging yourself to do, or even just recommendations that you want to make of diverse authors or women authors, or whatever category that they occupy, then by all means go do that down in the comments. But again, keep in mind, it is just meant to be about expanding your horizons or expanding your awareness of what often makes the cut in terms of mainstream reading, and then asking if whether or not you want to step outside of that. And if you don't, that's fine. And if you do, that's fine too. Everybody should just be reading what they want to read, because if this stops being a hobby and becomes a chore, who wants to do it? So again, hopefully we can have a really good discussion in the comments. If anybody has been upset by this in any way, or does want to come at me maybe on a more of a one-on-one level and doesn't want to kind of share it in the comments, I do always list my email address below, and I also list my Twitter handle usually, and you're free to send me a message there. But otherwise, again, happy reading. I still suck at outros, so hopefully we can have a really good discussion regardless. All right, bye bye.